So hello everybody, welcome to this new lunch lecture. Thank you for being here today. I am Babette Hermans and I will be hosting today's lunch lecture about the online circulation of fact checks. I'm really happy to welcome Babette Hermans, who will present really interesting insights in a few minutes. But first, let's talk about EDMO and the lunch lectures. So EDMO, as you know, is the European Digital Media Observatory, which brings together fact-checkers, journalists, experts, media literacy experts, and academic researchers to tackle, fight, or understand better disinformation. And within EDMO, there is different hubs, and EDMO BELUX is the hub that focuses on Belgium and on Luxembourg. And within that context, we organize lunch lectures, which is a series of webinars that are aimed at understanding better disinformation and related topics. So today we will listen to Babette Hermans. She is a PhD researcher in the Media, Information and Persuasion Lab at KU Leuven. And she's working on the PolKnow project, aiming on understanding political knowledge acquisition by young adults. And this political knowledge acquisition can be sometimes done through information, and maybe they can be sometimes misinformed. In this context, she focused on fact checks on political knowledge. And today she will present research results on the circulation of fact checks online. So who do they reach, who is engaging with them, and hopefully it can bring actionable insights for the disinformation mitigation community. The presentation will be about 30-40 minutes long and will be followed by a discussion. So for everyone that is here today, feel free to react and ask questions in the dedicated space in the chats, and I will use these comments to feed the discussion. So Babette, thank you again for being here, and I'll let you start your presentation.
Okay, thank you so much for having me today. I'm just gonna already start sharing my PowerPoint presentation. I hope it's all going well.
Yes.
Yeah, I see you nodding. Perfect. So thank you so much again for having me. I'm very, very excited to be giving this lunch lecture, which is gonna be a bit of a synthesis of my entire PhD up until now. So I will be focusing on the circulation of fact-checking, but also a bit what goes beyond that, and what happens when citizens encounter fact-checks in terms of learning. So I'm gonna see if this works. Yes. So first off, when I started off my PhD, I had to read a lot of articles on fact-checking and what was already out there in the literature. And I noticed that there was actually a lot of focus on effectiveness of fact-checks. So when citizens encounter fact-checks, do they learn from it or not? And how long do they learn from them, etc. But in my opinion, that missed sort of a step beforehand, namely answers to the questions of where do citizens exactly encounter fact checks, and also what that fact check public looks like. Because fact checks can be effective for some people, but not necessarily for other people. And that is a bit of a question that I first wanted to answer before looking further into the effectiveness of fact checks in my later stages. So in this first part, I will be focusing first on the dissemination of fact checks, so taking the perspective of the fact-checking organizations themselves, and then I will go deeper into the audience perception and also a little bit deeper into the learning of fact-checking. So first off, the dissemination. So I did a study that looked at how fact-check websites or articles on fact-check websites were remediated to social media posts. And we started this study from the idea that there has been some changes in news use from citizens. Many have moved more to social media, especially young citizens, for news and less to more traditional or websites media. And also because social media have been found to be a source of misinformation. So it would also be quite logical that fact checks are present there where the misinformation is also present. So this study focused specifically on remediation, which is this process of website articles being transferred to social media. So when diving deeper into the literature on remediation, a popular definition is that remediation is a translation of content from one platform to another. And this can happen in many different formats. For example, changes in language, for example, when you're shortening or lengthening a headline, for example, for a social media post. Including hyperlinks on Facebook is a form of remediation. Also choosing different topics, that's also a form of remediation. And there's much more to it. But especially for the fact-check context, remediation can be quite challenging. And that for different reasons. So there are quite some differences between the fact-check content that is traditionally on websites, and news that is on social media. There are different formats, for example, videos, and also a different pace. It goes way quicker on social media than that it takes for a fact-check to be written. That can take multiple hours or even days for a fact-check to be written, while news is way quicker than that. It can be over in a few minutes even. So that is, on the one hand, a challenge for fact-checkers. And then on the other hand, there are also some differences in professional attitudes. You have fact-checkers who say, well, we don't have to go to social media, or I don't want to adapt to these circumstances, etc. So that's also quite a bit of a challenge. You have to click again. Yes. So in this study, I first looked at the chronology of the dissemination on social media. So I checked whether or not website articles were transferred to social media and in what chronology that this happened. So I'll explain this a bit further because it's a bit abstract. So on the left-hand corner, you can see a website fact check, which is about free bus fares for immigrants, a claim that has been made, and that was checked and it turned out to be false. And from this website article, there were social media posts created about this. First, there was a Facebook post, there was also a TikTok post here, and there was also an Instagram post that was made about this. Now, the chronology aspect comes in when we look at the timestamps on which they were produced. So time point 0 is what we consider the website article because no remediation at this point had taken place. The Facebook article was published first on the 20th of November last year. So that became time point 1, the first time that the website article appeared on social media. The TikTok post about the same article was posted on the 26th of November, so that became time point 2. And then we had the Instagram post, which was posted on the 27th, and that became time point 3. So you see that there's this chronology in the posting of the content. This was a content analysis of around 15,000 items. So we had the news items on the website and then all of the related social media posts. And I created a chronology graph for it to see how it spread. And that is this one, which is a bit much, but I will take you through it. So you can see here we had 8 fact-check organizations that we included. So, for example, the BBC was included, VRT News, which is a Flemish public broadcaster, but also PolitiFact, a big American fact-checker that we also included. And so here at time point 0, this was the collection of all of their website fact checks published in a time span of 2 years. It was from January 2022 until December 2023, I think. Yeah, that's right. And so in time point 0, you can see already going from time point 0 to time point 1 that there are some differences between the amount of times that fact checkers remediate content from their websites to social media. So from all of the website articles that they have here, for example, from factcheck.org, you can see that about 75% of the articles is remediated to social media at time point 1. KNAK, which is also a Flemish newspaper, for example, only does around half of them, while PolitiFact almost reposts all of them to time point 1. The letters are also a bit small, but what we notice here mostly is that a lot of the fact checks go to Facebook, especially in time point 1. And then from time point 1 to time point 2, there's already a lot of content that does not get remediated. The parts are getting a lot smaller, and this trend also goes further to time point 3 and time point 4, where almost no content is remediated. What we also notice is that Instagram and TikTok, the more visual and also time-intensive platforms for fact-checkers, only become popular at a later stage and not very much at time point 1. Yes, I also focus specifically on the Flemish ones, but I think the international picture is also quite interesting. So what we learned mostly from this study is that Facebook is actually the most popular platform for fact checks to be remediated on, which is also quite logical, as this is, a very easy platform for content to be remediated. You can just put a hyperlink to the article and just write a little text, and that's it. Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube are way more time intensive, so it's also a bit logical that they are less popular. Then we also notice high transfer rates, although they are quite different across organizations, with some of them reposting almost nothing or around half of their content, while others repost almost everything. Then there's a lot of one-shot distribution, which is like the big burst that you could see on the left-hand side of the graph, where not a lot of content is reposted to time point 2 or time point 3. So it's just the article, one post about it, and that's it. And then also, but I didn't go into deeper detail about this here, we also looked at which topics were remediated, because there is some fear for news softening, where there's only talk about more, not relaxing topics, but more softer topics, such as sports or even health topics. But in fact-checking, that's not really the case. There's a lot of hard news still in those fact-checks, also on social media. But these findings also raise some questions for us. For example, the popularity of Facebook. This is not a platform where youngsters are quite active. So this is also a bit, they're also potentially missing out on a specific demographic because they are choosing to post on a specific platform the most. And then also concerning the one-shot distribution, there are some benefits found in literature for repeated exposure. So if a person would see a fact check 3 or 4 times, they are quite more likely to remember it better, in contrast to only seeing it once. So there's an argument to be made for having more variancy in the content that you make, even though it's also quite time intensive for the fact checkers. But also, this was a study conducted before Meta decided to stop collaborating with fact checkers, which will definitely damage the funding for these fact checkers. They will have less resources to use to remediate the content also to more time-intensive platforms. So we'll have to see a bit how that turns out. And also the way that Meta decided to communicate their decision could also damage the levels of trust in fact checkers, because they were quite keen on preserving freedom of speech, for example. So we'll have to see what that does with the levels of trust in fact checkers. So that was one study of mine in my PhD, where I looked at more the distribution of fact checks. And now we can switch to how they are received. I have to make the side note that this is data from Flemish citizens. There might be some changes for Walloon citizens, for example, or citizens for other countries. But I think that the findings are still quite interesting. So for this part of my PhD, I started off with some basic questions. So first off, I just wanted to know, how often do Flemish citizens encounter fact checks? Because when starting from the production perspective, there can be quite a lot of fact checks produced, but that does not necessarily mean that citizens also see the fact checks themselves. So that was one question that I asked. Then again, where do they encounter the fact checks? And then also, what do they do with them once they encounter them? And so what we did for this is we had a representative survey of Flemish citizens with around 2,500 participants. And what we found here is we differentiated first off between generations because we wanted to see how different age groups encounter and engage with fact checks. And so we asked the basic question, well, how often do you see fact checks? And when looking at the responses, the exposure levels seem quite high. So around 64.8% of Gen Z, for example, indicate that they see fact checks on a weekly basis or more often. That's the highest group. Gen X is the group with the lowest exposure to fact checks, but it's still around half of them that indicated that they see fact checks on a weekly basis or more, which is, in my opinion, still quite an interesting finding and a positive one also. But we also decided to differentiate between sole exposure and actual reading of a fact check, because I think we all can agree that there's a big difference between seeing something quickly while you're scrolling as compared to actually reading content. And especially on social media, this can be a bit challenging. So when looking at reading, we see that the numbers are a bit lower, and where Gen Z, for example, was the one that was exposed the most often or indicated that they saw fact checks the most often, they are actually the group that reads them the least when they encounter them. So around 30% of Gen Z reads fact checks. And the maximum is around 45% of millennials who read fact checks when they encounter them. But I also think that it's very interesting to make this distinction, especially also for research on effectiveness and in the current climate of social media. So those are these findings. And when looking at where they encounter them the most, there are no real big surprises here. So Gen Z encounters them mostly on social media, millennials and Gen X mostly on websites, and boomers mostly through traditional media such as newspapers or the radio. But not all social media platforms are equal. So, oh no, that's another finding. I'm gonna come back to that comment later. So first off, I'm gonna go deeper into the discussion about what I call the Flemish citizen, because I've been talking about, well, Flemish citizens and Gen Z and Gen X have seen them the most often. Well, there has been some value in making the distinction between those citizens also, because we see also from our research that there are several factors that impact whether or not citizens see fact checks more often than others. And the factors that we find that have an impact on this are education level, political interest, and media use. So those citizens who have higher education levels, more political interest, and also higher media use are more likely to encounter fact checks as compared to those with lower education level or lower political interest. So that is also something that, as a creator of fact checks, you have to take into account that you are already creating content for a very specific group and that they are most likely to encounter it. But then you also have to ask the question, is this the group that is the most vulnerable? And do I want to reach this specific group or maybe a more vulnerable group? So what we take away from this study is that even though citizens indicate that they relatively often encounter fact checks, that it does not automatically mean that they also read them. And we also find a differentiation in the public, a first differentiation in my research, that there are differences between media use and also where citizens encounter fact checks. And also a differentiation in who you are as a person, and that also impacts your exposure levels. So having the right skills, motivation, and opportunities, increases your chances of encountering fact checks and reading them. So my fact check or my project specifically focuses mostly on youngsters. So we wanted to go a bit deeper into the behaviors or the behaviors of this group when it comes to fact check exposure and reading and learning from fact checks. So we wanted to focus on very specific fact checks because also in my earlier research, a lot of the questions are mostly about general fact check exposure and how these fact checks, if you remember, if you generally saw a fact check, but it's quite well, it's a valid measure, but it's also a bit vague. So what we decided to do was we tried to pinpoint more specifically exposure to specific fact checks. And we did this through a mobile experience sampling study where we tracked 200 youngsters between 16 and 30 years old. And we questioned them on a daily basis over the course of 1 week. So we gave them a survey every night at 8 p.m. And we did this in the context of the fact check marathon that took place during the elections last year in June, because otherwise there aren't that many fact checks that we can question citizens about, but now the tempo of the production was way higher, so that we could specifically ask questions about exposure and knowledge also on these specific fact checks. I think one side note I have to make here is that these youngsters were sampled based on earlier responses to fact check exposure questions. So those who were included in the study had earlier indicated that they at least sometimes saw fact checks, or no, at least regularly saw fact checks during the week. So that was already a bit of a subsample. And it's quite important for the findings to put them into context. So when we talk about specific exposure, well, these are in Dutch, but I'll translate them for you. So we asked them very specifically about 14 fact checks that were produced during the week. So we asked about 2 each day. There were questions about social issues. For example, the first one, it's about trees that were being cut down in Flanders. So that's more of a social issue. There were fact checks about more political processes. So a lot of them were political because of the election context, but some were more focused on politics. For example, this one about conscription, where youngsters would be asked to join the army, something also that youngsters were quite nervous about. And then there were also fact checks about economy. For example, one about how 1% of the Flemish citizens have a specific percentage of the total amount of goods in Belgium. That was also a fact check. And so we had questions about 14 specific fact checks. And we see that the exposure levels to these specific fact checks vary quite a bit. So there was one fact check about gender-neutral toilets in kindergartens that wasn't seen by a lot of respondents. Only 2.5% of the questioned youngsters saw that one. While another fact check on personalized political advertisements was seen quite a lot. So that was around half of the respondents that said that they had seen that fact check. Again, differentiating between exposure and reading, we find that youngsters do not always read further. So the most respondents indicated that they only superficially read the fact check, so only reading the title, for example, while a smaller part indicated that they really read the article itself in depth. So that's a distinction that we also find in this data set. Then again, we find social media as the most important source. Websites around 21%, and the traditional media around 4% only. And then here I'm coming back to the social media platforms, that not all of them are equal. And I also said in the beginning, fact checkers themselves are mostly present on Facebook, and that there is a concern that youngsters do not encounter them there. And that is also what we find in this data. So we see that around 86% of the youngsters who had indicated that they saw a fact check on social media saw it on Instagram. And then the next platform is TikTok, and around only 6% of the youngsters saw it there. And then Facebook is even smaller, so under 5% saw the fact check there. I also added Twitter and YouTube, but yeah, those were quite minimal exposure levels. But it's also possible that there was just no remediation of the fact check to YouTube, for example. So that would also explain the low percentages. Then I also dove deeper into engagement with the content. So when looking at research on engagement with content, not a lot of them look at, for example, reading, as we already did. But I thought that there were some other measures that were also quite interesting. So we asked the respondents if they saw a fact check on social media, and if they did, what they actually did with it. So we had questions on if you liked it or commented on, shared it. We also added another engagement metric, which was more about talking about it with friends and family, so more in a informal setting, which we also thought would be an interesting one to figure out. Or we just had a question, I just did nothing with it when I encountered it. And we also noticed that that is the most popular one. So a lot of respondents just, they see it and they even read it, but they just don't do anything with it. That happened most often. And on the second place, they gave it a like, but that still was quite a minimal amount of citizens that did so. And then the third one that happened the most, not the least often, but of the main three, it happened the least often, was talking about it with friends and family informally, which I still think is quite an interesting finding, because it's one that is not often measured in science, but it could still be valuable. And it means that, or it indicates that a fact check has sparked attention or interest, and that people wanted to talk about it with other people, to check it or to see if they had other information. So I think that's also quite an interesting finding. And then I wanted to briefly talk about learning from fact checks. Because I do think it's also quite interesting for the rest of my PhD, but also for a lot of those working on fact checks. So in this part of my PhD, I shifted the focus to effectiveness, and I wanted to know how exposure to fact checks is related to more general political knowledge. Because a lot of the research now focuses more on fact checks and knowledge related to the specific fact check. But fact-checking organizations also have the goal to contribute to more of a democratic society. And another potential outcome could be not necessarily claim specific knowledge, but more general political knowledge. And the one that we measured in this study is called contested issue knowledge. And this is knowledge about topics that have emerged recently that have mostly also become heavily contested. So you can think about the vaccines or climate change or migration. These are heavily debated topics, and there's a lot of misinformation, even misinformation campaigns about them. And it can also be more difficult to correct those. So for this study, we relied on a 3-wave panel study that we constructed ourselves, and we again focused more broadly on citizens between 16 and 30 years old. And now I'm going to be showing a bit of a complex research model, but I will take you through it. So what we have here on this first line is just the 3 measurement points of exposure to fact checks that we had in the 3 waves. So how often did you see fact checks? And we asked that 3 times over time. And then we also asked our 9 knowledge questions 3 times across the 3 waves. So this model is actually a reflection of a statistical approach, which is called quite difficultly random intercept panel modeling, but it's just a specific way of looking at longitudinal data. So what you do is you link exposure to fact checks, in this case, to contested issue knowledge over time, which you can see over here. So it's these arrows downwards. But you also link, for example, contested issue knowledge to exposure over time. You link exposure to exposure and knowledge to knowledge. And with this method, you can disentangle effects within a person and between groups of people. So it makes it a bit more specific in your measurement, which is very good for these complex data sets. So what we found, maybe lastly, these at the top, these are the random intercepts, which is a bit of a mean score on these items across the three waves. And this allows you to compare between groups, while these items in the middle allow you to compare within one person. But I'll try to explain it with the results a bit better. So we found some interesting results, but also not necessarily the ones that we wanted, but that's also part of conducting research. So first off, when comparing between groups, so the ovals at the top and the bottom, we do find some positive associations. So this means that those groups who more often see fact checks also tend to have higher knowledge, which is good, which is what we want. But when looking at the items in the middle, this is a change within one person. So for example, if I would be part of this survey, I would give a score in the first way. For example, I see fact checks weekly on average, and I have a mediocre level of issue knowledge. These measures, well, they reflect how my knowledge changes from my own knowledge over time. And we see, and I think that's the one that I want to focus on the most, is that exposure to fact checks has been negatively linked to this contested issue knowledge, both within one wave, so quite short term, and also across a 1.5 month wave. So that is quite an interesting finding. So if I am more exposed to fact checks than I normally am during that week, I also have lower levels of knowledge than I normally have. So that is what those findings reflect. I understand that they're quite difficult, so if there are any questions about this towards the end, please feel free to ask them. But to come back to that again, so what we see is some positive and significant between-person associations. So we do see that fact checks, to a certain extent, fulfill the democratic goal to inform a public, to create a more informed citizenry, which is good for your democracy. But also, what we see a bit as a potential preaching to your own choir effect, because if you are more likely to see fact checks, you are more likely to have higher knowledge. But this also means that if you are less likely to see fact checks, then you also are less likely to have that knowledge. So that's a bit of a gap that we have to take into account. And then the inconsistent within-person effects that I explained, I now focused on the more negative ones, but we had that for another type of knowledge also, and then also for reading with fact checks, but that took a bit too long to incorporate in this presentation. But we find very inconsistent effects. So this might also just be a statistical thing, and that we find random stuff that does not necessarily mean anything concrete, but they are still things to look out for. And we can generally say that for a given person, fact checks do not necessarily increase political knowledge over time. And that is something to take into account. So I'm going to try to wrap this up a bit. So I had some key takeaways that I hope can spark some discussion, or that you can take with you in your own work or your own interests. So again, what we find is that fact checkers are mostly present on Facebook, but that youngsters themselves are less present on there in the first place, but also encounter fact checks there less often. So that is a bit of a discrepancy that we find concerning distribution and exposure strategies. Then we found that there has to be more focus on the differentiation of your audiences based on personal characteristics. So those with higher political interest or lower political interest, high media use, lower education level. And that has to also be taken into account, that when you make content, you have to think about who am I reaching and who do I want to reach, and that maybe strategies might differ there also. And then again, also that encountering content does not necessarily equal reading of the content, and that is quite important to make engaging content that captures attention from different citizen groups. That makes it they read further, because especially this reading can be quite important for actual learning effects to take place. But so what I really found in general is that there has, with the strategies and the characteristics of the audience that are currently present in the fact-checking environment, that there is quite a risk of preaching to your own choir, because we found that once you have specific skills, namely political interests, education level, and higher media use, you are more likely to see fact checks, so your exposure increases, or your chance of exposure increases. And then when you have higher chances of exposure, you also have higher chances of increasing your knowledge. But the other way around, you also have people with lower skills who are less likely to see fact checks and who are consequently also less likely to have knowledge on these topics. And it might be that especially those groups, or I think that it is those groups with those lack of skills, who might be more vulnerable to misinformation in the first place. So I now called it a preaching to your own choir effect. You also have the Matthäus effect, which is this rich get richer, and in this case, the smart get smarter effect. That is something that we have to take into account when creating content and when looking at fact checks. But I think I've said enough, and I'm really looking forward to discussing this topic with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this really interesting presentation. A lot of things to to react to, I think. So if someone wants to react or ask question, don't hesitate to use the dedicated space in the chat. There is already one question about the way the social media works. So given how quickly FAIR travels on social media, what strategies could be used to reach those who are most exposed to FAIR-driven misinformation but aren't seeing corrections? Do you have insights about that?
Yes, I'm going to reread the question really quick. To fear-driven misinformation but aren't seeing corrections. Well, that's a very good question. Well, I think I think a difficult part to answer this question is the fact that fear-driven misinformation travels so quickly, and corrections are quite difficult to keep up with it. So I think or corrections in the current formats are quite difficult to follow that. So what I think would be interesting, or a possible approach, would be to be present in those conversations as a fact checker. So to not, for example, create a specific post around it, and that can take like a few hours to write a full article, but to just try. And I know that this is difficult, and I'm speaking from a researcher perspective and not a practitioner perspective, but to be present in the comment section, for example, and there you can just answer really quickly, like, hey, I understand that this is frightening and that this is that this concerns you, but we found a fact check that contradicts this, for example, or an article that contradicts this, and then you can post it there immediately. And then I think that would already help, just being present where that content also is. I hope that is an okay answer.
Yeah, I think that's part of a larger question of how to fight with the same weapons as this kind of content, right? So we know how social networks and social platforms work, but how fact checkers can transform the way they bring fact checks to these spaces for these to be shared, because you say that fact checks can be part of the conversation because people can share fact checks with their families and friends. So, but how to be sure that it spreads more on social networks? That's kind of difficult, right?
Yes, and I do think, I really think that they should be part of the conversation also, because they're very valuable tools for knowledge correction, and they've shown to work. I think it's just a question again of how do we create this type of content that works for different groups of people, and to be an answer to the needs of the citizens also. Yeah.
There was a question more about the methodology, so about the data collection and the software you use to analyze the data collected. And if I'm not wrong, you used data also from EDMO, no, from BenEDMO.
Yes, I from BenEDMO mostly, not
Yes.
from EDMO. But so I think when it's looking at the data for software, so I relied on different data types in this presentation. So the first one was a content analysis, and this was data was collected partly manually. So I copy pasted a lot of links in an Excel sheet, and then added timestamps to them, for example. So that was done manually for the websites for Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. But Facebook showed to be just too big of a data set, and we had that scraped from someone that we knew from TextGain, and he did that for us. And then I compiled all of it in my big Excel sheet, and I started doing the coding myself. And then for the other studies that I presented, I either relied on a survey study, a cross-sectional survey study with the entire Flemish population. I had a three-wave panel study that we did with youngsters between 16 and 30 years old. And then we had an ESM study which tracked 200 respondents also between 16 and 30 years old. So that is the data that I relied on.
And if I'm not wrong, you in the article about the first part of the research that you showed today, you said also that you didn't take the stories or that kind of data, if I'm not wrong, because of course it's complicated to keep them. I just have a question. Is there any information about the use of these stories by fact checkers, or do they use it or not?
Yeah, I didn't include it in the study because I collected the data in retrospect. So I started the study in 2024, and stories are only there for 24 hours, so I couldn't see those. So I decided to leave those out. But I can only speak from anecdotal evidence. I don't know of any research that looked at this specific type of content, but I think that they are used mostly to repost their own posts, for example, like you can also do in their stories. I do think that there are also some organizations who work with like Q&A sessions, for example, where you can like ask a question in the question box and they can answer it for you. That is also something that is used. But I think that is mostly the extent of it. I don't think it's used as a separate strategy by a lot of fact checkers, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, and I'll come back to that later. I have another question about the contested issue knowledge. So from the last study, so it's a question about what kind of questions you asked, and can you provide some examples maybe?
Yeah, of course. So we decided to construct these items ourselves because we wanted to have items that were relevant for the Flemish case. So what we did is I tracked fact checks production for a couple of months, and then we saw what came out of those. We also looked at what were discussions that were quite lively in Flanders. And then we got some topics out of those, and then we created questions. So questions were, for example, it was more statement-like, and then they had to say to what extent that they agreed with the statements or not. So one statement, for example, is that refugees, that they flee mostly to neighboring countries and not necessarily to the EU, for example. So that was one question. So it was about immigration. Then we also had questions about climate change. And that was, for example, a statement that humans contribute to climate change, for example, that it's also us as humanity that contributes to it and not just a natural process, for example. And then we also had questions about health. And there was, for example, a question on contraception, and that women who use the pill would have more trouble getting pregnant once they stop using it, which is not the case. But that was, for example, also a statement. And then they had to say, I think this statement is true or is not true. And we had 9 statements of those, 3 for each theme. So climate change, migration, and health, because those seem to be the most lively, related to politics, and also had some, some misinformation campaigns surrounding them.
Yeah, and about this, the fact that fact checks maybe do not increase political knowledge over time. Did you compare to maybe fact checked with actual classic news? Is there any study about that, about the effect of classic news on political knowledge?
I think there's quite a lot of studies on that. I didn't do that in this study because I already compared exposure and reading, and then I also relied on a different type of knowledge. So that was already quite complex to get into one paper. But I do think that there are quite a lot of studies on news exposure and reading, and that most of them show some positive signs also for learning, that you learn when you read the news. There are some impacts about how many different sources that you use, how diverse your news sources are, which ones you rely on. But I think in general, the trend is quite positive.
And I had questions based on your key takeaways. I think it's something that was really that we can see. Sorry, that we can see through your research is this maybe the fact that maybe there are no strategies that are really focusing on the way people are informed. So seeing these studies, I was asking myself. Is there something related maybe to the way journalists and fact checkers work? I mean, their process of work. So they do what they know they can do. So creating news, creating fact checks on websites, etc. And then there is this question of maybe remediation or dissemination, but it's most of the time maybe a second step, and maybe it's not adapted because the response has to be adapted through remediation. So I had one question about the differences maybe between what do NGOs do and media do. Is there any difference? Because we saw that one of the NGO, for example, was a lot on a social platforms, right? So maybe it's related to these questions.
Yeah, we also we looked at that in the study more in depth, and we actually didn't. We found some surprising differences, but not any consistent differences. So it's not that, for example, NGOs were more or less present on social media than the news, like the media fact checkers. So there weren't any real consistent findings there. But what I mentioned, or what I mean with surprising findings, is that newsroom or media fact checkers often have more resources and larger audiences already at their reach, so they can rely on the audiences built by the newsrooms, and also the resources provided by the newsrooms, because NGOs have to rely on donations and they are more restricted in their in what money they can use. But for example, PolitiFact as an NGO, they had a lot of remediation of content, while the BBC, which is like this established media, they just didn't remediate almost anything to any platform. So that I think is most surprising, that even though you might have the resources, they choose not to put them into the distribution of their fact checks. So they may write them, but they are not necessarily making the effort of distributing it further, while more NGO platforms. Also Knack, for example, they have like around 50%, but it's still quite a lot. So they really actively choose to remediate their content and to focus on spreading the word, for example, like, to say that. So we did find some differences, not consistently. That's my answer.
And there is another question from Geoffroy Patriarche. A part that's a long question. The research on fact-check exposure and the research on disinformation and misinformation exposure and the similarities maybe there is between two of them. He say, for instance, higher political interest is also something that increases the chance to come across misinformation. So there might be similar factors that play concerning media use for both parts. So he asked if you know any study or reference that has addressed this question.
Sorry, what is the specific question? So
about the fact that the exposure, the general exposure about misinformation exposure and fact check exposure.
So I think that's just your audience characteristics, they are quite similar for specific types of formats, which is, I think, can be, well, negative, but also positive. So if you have, for example, higher level of political interest, then you're also more likely to see misinformation, but also across fact checks that can work into your, I don't know the English expression for this, I'm so sorry, but it can be beneficial for you. So I do not have any specific questions or studies that work on this, but I do think that it seems a bit, that it seems a logical one also. There's just specific characteristics that you have and that determine which content that you see, and it can be positive and it can be negative. It hasn't, to my knowledge, been studied specifically, but would be interesting to do so in the future. Definitely, but I'm sorry, I cannot send you any specific studies.
And I think that instinctively, I had a question too about, you say that people that are more exposed to fact checks are people that are newspaper readers, right? So, and I was also thinking, maybe they are, like you said in the conclusion, maybe the less vulnerable group or less vulnerable group because they read news, so maybe they are not that much impacted by misinformation. But I don't know if there is any sources for that. It was just instinctive.
No. I do think that there would be quite some studies on that. It wasn't only newspaper. It was just reading news in general on different sources. So we asked a lot of them. We had radio and TV and social media and even alternative news sources, like alternative media, that is related to higher exposure and also higher knowledge. But I do think that it's this. And I'm also working on that right now. Like this diversity of news sources can even be more valuable than just reading one news source. And if fact checks could be part of that, that would be, I think, the best option, that you have like just general news, but also specific news or like content created for knowledge correction.
And about specific exposure, I think that was really interesting to see that the exposure levels really vary from one to another. So I guess it's based on the profile, so the algorithms, etc. But what's interesting maybe is the fact that the bubble logic follow maybe a profile, but the profile is not related to topics, maybe because you won't see something you are interested in and then the fact check related to something you are interested in. So it's interesting that the topics the profile are more complex and maybe do not necessarily take into account the interest to a specific topic.
That's also what research on these information bubbles, or filter bubbles, as they're also called, shows that it's actually that people are still quite provided with diverse content, and that even though they may not be interested in sports, I'm not very interested in sports, for example, but I see a lot of sports news, and so it just keeps you in touch with other information. Of course, you have a lot of, or like the bulk of what you see is your interests and also a bit your opinion, or like news that goes along with that opinion maybe, but there's also a lot of different and diverse topics that just pique your interest and make you read more. So yeah, that's definitely something.
Okay, thank you. There is a last question I forgot to ask you before. When we were about the contested issue knowledge, someone is asking regarding the immigration question, if you have noticed a more conservative or progressive view on this topic.
Yes, we have, but it's been quite a while since I've dove deeper into this data, so I have to be careful with what I say. But I do think that, for example, for the more, the immigration questions, that's, well, a lot of them, those were the worst questions that people had correct. So when you look at the proportion of people who answered those questions correctly, it was very, very low. And for example, there was also this question that was quite conspiratorial even, and it was about how Flemish citizens, in this case, are strategically being replaced by immigrants, for example. That was a statement. And sadly, the ones who said that that was true was quite a large amount. So we do notice, and also looking at the left-right positioning related to that, that there are quite some differences for those knowledge effects. For those knowledge levels, I'm sorry, but also, for example, regarding age, that young men, for example, are way more conservative or have conservative views or are more likely to agree with these false statements, and more progressive citizens, for example. So that is something that we do find. Yes.
Thank you. So it's already 2 o'clock, so it's the end of the session. I think we could have more discussion, but maybe in other places, in other time. So that brings us to the end of today's lunch lecture. Thank you again, Babette, and to all of you for being part of the discussion. So we look forward to seeing you at the next lunch lecture, which will be in 2026, of course. This is recorded and will be online in a few days. So have a nice week, have a nice holidays, and bye.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for listening.